Hello everyone, this is Mr. Frazier again. Giving me a quick module here on South American history. I wanted to remind you that everything we talk about here is unscripted, and as such you're going to hear me make mistakes, sound silly, stumble over my own words. It's going to be a mess, but in a good way. So let's begin. We're going to quickly look at the three major regions of South America as we decided to define them. We're going to look at the Caribbean region, the Pampas and Andes, and Brazil. This first video is on the Caribbean region, located right here in northern South America. Now we want to be careful when we say Caribbean region. We're not talking about the Caribbean Sea and the islands that are located there. We are solely talking about Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana. So when you do research on this region or you look for more information on the history of this region, remember that you need to search those countries' names individually. Because if you search just Caribbean, you'll get countries like Haiti, Cuba, Puerto Rico, all these things that really have nothing to do with what we're studying right now, though they're interesting. So let's talk about the history of the Caribbean region, and the way we're going to do that is by focusing specifically on Venezuela. Colombia will come up a little bit, but we're going to focus on Venezuela. And the reason we're going to focus on that country is because the histories of the other countries in that region relate specifically to what's going on in Venezuela. So we're going to begin right after independence. Let's take a look. In the Caribbean region, right after independence, we have a class system that remains where the Criollos are at the top. And if you remember, the Criollos are Europeans born in the Americas. And they're at the top because, if you remember before independence, the Peninsulares were at the top, and those were Europeans born in Europe. But with the end of colonialism, you have the South American countries less likely to be happy about a European ruling them or in charge of the economy or in positions of power. So what we do is we have people of European ancestry, basically Caucasians, in charge in South America. Beneath them, we have the mestizos. The mestizos, interestingly enough, are Euro-Indian peoples, and then beneath them are mulatto, which are Euro-Indian African peoples. So they're people who are as a result of those marriages. Now this system remains in place, and basically what you have is you have the colonial economies trying to exist without the buyers in Europe. So if you remember back to the colonial economy, just really quickly, the colonial economy relied heavily on gold and silver in Spanish South America. And also in the Caribbean South America, you also have some plantation, so some cash crop. Now, the reason why we bring up the colonial economy is because after independence, they're trying to mine gold and silver and to plant crops like sugarcane and make money off it for their economy. The reality is, however, that this sort of economy can't exist without a European country that's dedicated to buy from you. So in essence, the Caribbean region after independence is economically in challenge. And so what they do is they turn to a series of dictators. Now I'm going to erase these notes on the side just to give us some room here. They turn to a series of dictators, okay? And what a dictator is a ruler who is one person that has total control. Now the reason they turn to these dictators is, first of all, they have a history of listening to a king, and so this style of government where one person is at least in name in charge, they're used to. The other reason they turn to a dictator is that the dictators are supported by the military. Now this military support gives the rulers the opportunity to tightly control the economy and make sure at least the Criollos are making out well. Even though they had a very weak economy because they're relying on gold and silver and some plantation work, the dictators were able to make sure that independence could be maintained, which to them was most important. So I'm sorry. So let's start talking about Venezuela. In Venezuela, we have the discovery of oil in the early 1800s. And this discovery is significant because instead of taking away the wealth from the Criollos, who, let's face it, were only wealthy because of their racial identity, it actually made inequality and wealth even worse. So what happened is the oil was found in Lake Maracaibo, and I'll show you a map in a moment. And when this oil is found, it's found on the land of Criollos because, let's face it, the Criollos owned pretty much the entire country. So for about 100 years, the Criollos controlled this oil wealth, and this oil wealth becomes even more significant with the invention of automobiles and aircraft in the late 1800s, early 1900s. In 1948, after the conclusion of World War II until 1957, we have a period that's specifically called La Violencia. And this was a time of political violence. And during this time, many people died or just simply disappeared. And what caused this is a response to the income inequality. Basically, in Venezuela, you're going to see the difference between the wealthy and the poor is going to cause political change. And so, during La Violencia, a force of rebels wanted to overthrow the government. So that was their goal, was to overthrow the government and redistribute the wealth. Now, if you remember redistribution from our candy game, is when all of the resources in the economy are handed out either evenly or according to some system. This fails because, again, the military at this time was backing the wealthy Criollos. This will change, however, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. I just want to show you some maps here. Lake Maracaibo is located in northern Venezuela. Here's Venezuela here. Here's where it's located. Lake Maracaibo is right here near Colombia in the central part here. It almost looks like it's connected to the sea, the Caribbean Sea, but it's not. There's a small isthmus here, basically, that connects Maracaibo, the town, to the rest of eastern Venezuela. So it's a beautiful lake region. The oil is found underneath the lake and along the edges of the lake. And this is this picture I included here just to foreshadow. The drilling of oil in this region will have environmental consequences, which we'll talk about in class. So I just wanted you to have an image in your mind of the consequences of this oil besides the political unrest. So let's go back to our history. Okay. In the 1960s, the landowners, in response to fears caused by La Violencia, actually will hire private armies, okay, for protection from rebels. These private armies are called paramilitaries. That's a term you're going to want to know. And so these wealthy landowners will actually make their own pseudo-armies to protect their land. And this makes sense when there's rebels in the countryside threatening to take your things and give them away to the poor. So they have these private armies. And the result of this is that these armed forces are not supported by the government, but they have the effect of taking candidates for the government's military and having them go to these higher paying paramilitary groups. So basically the government forces, which were tasked with avoiding situations like La Violencia, were made weaker because people turned to the paramilitary groups instead of relying on the military itself. And so conflict and violence will actually continue, and then the rebels, government and military forces, this relationship results in 1979 of an overthrow of the Venezuelan government. Basically, the military was weakened to such an extent that the rebel groups weren't the ones to overthrow the government. The military was. The military, which had to fill its ranks with the poor because the wealthy candidates for military service went to these private armies where there was money. These individuals who came from a poor background actually pushed within the military for the nationalization of the oil industry. And so what is nationalization? That's when you take ownership of something and redistribute it, give it out. Their goal in 1976, the goal was to redistribute it evenly. So basically, everybody gets a fair share. And if you remember back to our candy activity, that's a very hard task. And in fact, it was largely a failure because as they took over these resources, the military is working with this new military-backed government, and it's not handled properly. A democratic solution is reached in 1989. A man by the name of Hugo Chavez is elected president of Venezuela. Now, Hugo Chavez is a very controversial figure in the United States, and we'll talk about that in class if you're interested. But here's what he did for Venezuelan history. He moved the country towards a command economy, and if you remember, a command economy is where the government controls everything. I remember, if I'm writing something down, it's probably important enough for you to write down. And so what they did is, instead of trying to seize or nationalize the oil industry, which they tried to do in 1979, instead of just taking it over and handing out the wealth individually, Hugo Chavez, his model was far more successful because what he did was he actually just made it expensive to do oil business in Venezuela. In essence, he made it so that if you want to be an oil company working in Venezuela, you have to be willing to be taxed heavily and give a lot of your money to the Venezuelan government. Then what he did, which made him very popular, is he offered food, healthcare, education, and other goods that the poor did not have access to for free. So instead of just handing out cash to the poor, he gave services to the poor and actually to the entire country, which helped to increase his popularity. But this made him unpopular with the business community because they saw his heavy taxing, and let's face it, his control of the economy as bad for business. And these conflicts still exist today. And so in Venezuela, you had Hugo Chavez. This is Chavez, okay? Chavez. And he ran the country until recently, where he passed away. And then Maduro, who's their new president, continues these policies, though we're not quite sure if they're going to end up successful. There's conflict continues, and the long-term success of it hasn't been tested, of course. But these policies, this move towards a command economy in Venezuela, is similar to what has happened, or didn't happen, in the rest of the countries in the Caribbean region. So just to recap, Venezuelan history moved from a time of trying to rely on the colonial model, which was gold, silver, plantations, which was largely unsuccessful under independence, to the luck of finding oil. However, the oil in the old system left the Criollos, who were the Caucasians, at the top. And what happened is there was a push for just over 150 years for the poor to have more control, the mestizos and the mulattoes to have more control over the economy, in essence, to have more access to wealth, to the point where a command economy was established in Venezuela, where the government took control of resources, and instead of handing out cash, the way they were able to institute a government control program was they offered services, lowered prices on food and healthcare, and education. So this is our quick history of modern Venezuela and look at the Caribbean region. Remember, you can rewind this for your notes, and do not be afraid to ask me questions, whether it's in class or via email. Thanks for listening, guys. Let me see if I can get out of here. Let's see.